I was carrying a tray of fresh cinnamon rolls when I heard my father promise away the company I had spent 12 years building. The ovens were still warm. The smell of butter and sugar filled the kitchen, while laughter drifted in from the dining room. It was supposed to be my father's retirement celebration, a night for speeches, old memories, and family. Instead, it became the night I realized my own family had already decided my future without me. I didn't storm into the room. I didn't throw the tray. I didn't even make a sound. I simply stood there behind the kitchen door, listening as my mother laughed and told my younger brother exactly where his new office would be. Then I smiled, because by the end of that week, there wouldn't be a bakery left for anyone to inherit. Welcome back. I'm Rachel, 36 years old, and this is the story of how my family tried to hand my life's work to my brother and accidentally lost everything instead. If you've ever watched people take credit for something you built with your own hands, stay with me. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this ends. People always assumed my father built Hartwell Bakery. Technically, they weren't wrong. He opened the first little shop nearly 40 years ago with my mother. It was one tiny storefront with 3 employees, old ovens that constantly broke, and just enough customers to keep the lights on. What people didn't know was that by the time I turned 24, the bakery was drowning. Bills stacked higher every month. Suppliers were demanding payment. Employees whispered about finding other jobs. The bank had already rejected another loan. My father never admitted how bad things were. I found out by accident when I came home after finishing business school and saw him sitting alone at one of the empty tables, staring at a pile of unpaid invoices like they were written in another language. He looked defeated. I'd never seen my father look defeated, so I stayed. Originally, it was only supposed to be for a few months. Help reorganize the finances, negotiate with suppliers, modernize the bookkeeping. Then I'd move to Chicago and start the corporate career I'd spent years preparing for. A few months turned into a year. 1 year became 5. 5 became 12. I rebuilt everything. I negotiated new supplier contracts, created online ordering before anyone else in town, opened catering, expanded into wholesale, found investors. Later, I bought every one of those investors out with my own money until I owned 80% of the business outright. Not because I wanted control, because nobody else believed the bakery was worth saving, except me. Dad remained the face everyone loved. Mom handled birthdays, church orders, and chatting with regular customers. I handled literally everything else. Payroll, taxes, expansion, hiring, equipment, marketing, every decision that kept those ovens running. I never complained. I believed family meant building something together. Looking back now, I think that was my biggest mistake. Because somewhere along the way, my family stopped seeing me as the person who saved the bakery. They started seeing me as the person who would always sacrifice. Kyle certainly did. My younger brother was 32 and somehow always between opportunities. That's how Mom described it. Between opportunities. Everyone else called it unemployed. He'd started a landscaping company that lasted 9 months, a food truck that closed before summer ended, an online clothing business that somehow lost money despite never selling enough shirts to fill a closet. Every failure ended the same way. Dad covered the debt, Mom defended him, and I quietly wrote another check to keep the family standing. Not because Kyle asked, because someone always did. He just needs one more chance. Things have been hard. You're doing so well already. Funny how people always decide what you can afford to lose. The retirement dinner was supposed to celebrate Dad finally stepping away after 4 decades. Every employee came. Old customers stopped by. My aunts, uncles, cousins, even a reporter from the local newspaper wanted a photo. The dining room buzzed with laughter while trays of pastries disappeared faster than we could refill them. Kyle walked around shaking everyone's hand like he was already hosting the event. People kept congratulating him. That struck me as strange. For what? I asked one of our oldest suppliers. He looked surprised. You'll see. Then he smiled and walked away. I caught Kyle grinning across the room. It wasn't his normal cocky grin. It was the grin of someone who already knew the ending to a story nobody else had heard. I told myself I was imagining things until I noticed blueprints sticking out of the leather folder tucked under his arm. When I asked what they were, He closed the folder before I could see. Just ideas. Ideas for what? He only winked. I laughed it off. I wish I hadn't. Dinner finally settled down. Dad stood to thank everyone for coming. He looked happier than I'd seen him in years. Relaxed. Proud. Almost relieved. He tapped his glass. "I've got one more surprise," he announced. "But first, Rachel, sweetheart, could you help your mother bring out dessert?" Everyone smiled. Of course I would. I always did. I carried 2 trays of cinnamon rolls into the kitchen while Mom brewed coffee. She was humming. Actually humming. The kind of happy humming she only did when she thought everything had worked out exactly the way she'd planned. I set the trays on the counter. "I'll grab the plates," I said. She smiled without looking at me. "Good girl." Then she walked back toward the dining room. I reached for the dessert plates and froze. Because just beyond the kitchen doorway, I heard my mother's voice. Soft, warm, certain. She wasn't asking a question. She was explaining a future that apparently everyone knew about except me. I stood perfectly still. The dessert plates were in my hands, but I couldn't feel them anymore. Just a few feet away, hidden by the kitchen wall, my mother was talking to Kyle and his wife Melissa, as casually as if they were discussing tomorrow's weather. "The office upstairs will make a perfect nursery," Mom said. Melissa laughed. "Oh, I was actually thinking Kyle could knock down that wall and make one larger office." "He can do whatever he wants," Mom replied. "Once everything's official, it's his business." My business. Every muscle in my body tightened. Kyle chuckled. "I'll probably replace the front managers first," Mom answered without hesitation. "They've been there forever. Fresh faces wouldn't hurt." Fresh faces? Those fresh faces she was talking about were people I'd hired, people whose kids I'd watched grow up, people who had trusted me enough to stay when the bakery almost went under. My father spoke next. "The customers love our family name. They'll support Kyle just like they supported me." Someone asked the question that made my heart stop. "What about Rachel?" There was a short silence. Then Mom answered, "Oh, she'll understand." Just 4 words. She'll understand. Not we'll ask Rachel. Not it's her decision. Just she'll understand. Melissa sighed dramatically. "I almost feel bad." "You shouldn't," Mom replied gently. "Rachel's smart. She could build another company if she wanted. Kyle needs this one more." The room laughed softly. I didn't. I carefully placed the dessert plates back on the counter before my hands dropped them. It wasn't anger I felt. Not at first. It was something colder, something clearer. Like finally putting on glasses after years of blurry vision. They weren't discussing an idea. They weren't asking for permission. This wasn't a conversation about possibilities. It was an announcement they had rehearsed. Everyone already knew. Except me. I thought back over the evening. The supplier congratulating Kyle. The blueprints, the knowing smiles, the whispers that stopped whenever I walked into the room. Even the newspaper photographer. How many people already believed Kyle owned the bakery? How long had they been planning this? Days? Weeks? Months? I dried my hands on a towel that didn't need drying. Then I looked at myself in the reflection of the kitchen window. I expected to see someone furious. Instead, I looked calm. Almost frighteningly calm. That's when I understood something. If I walked into that dining room screaming, I'd lose. Not legally. Emotionally. They'd paint me as the bitter daughter who couldn't let her struggling brother have one chance. The selfish businesswoman choosing money over family. The successful sister refusing to help. No. They had built the perfect trap. Every path except surrender made me the villain. So I chose a path they never imagined. I smiled. Then I picked up the dessert trays. When I walked back into the dining room, nobody noticed anything had changed. Mom smiled proudly. There she is. Dad motioned toward the empty chair beside him. Perfect timing. I set the cinnamon rolls on the table. People immediately reached for them. Our conversation picked back up. Kyle wouldn't stop smiling. He actually looked nervous. Excited nervous. Like a man about to receive the greatest gift of his life. Dad stood again and tapped his fork against his glass. The room slowly quieted. "I've spent 40 years waking up before sunrise," he began. "I've watched this little bakery become something this town loves." People nodded. Some of our oldest customers even clapped. Dad looked around the room proudly. "But every chapter has an ending." He paused dramatically. "And every ending deserves a new beginning." Kyle sat a little straighter. Melissa reached over and squeezed his hand. I watched them. Neither of them looked surprised. Of course they didn't. They'd already heard this speech. Dad smiled. So tonight, I'm proud to announce that our family bakery will officially be passed on to the next generation. The room erupted into applause before he even finished. Then he turned toward Kyle. My son. There isn't anyone I'd rather see continue my legacy. More applause. Someone whistled. Kyle stood up, pretending to be overwhelmed. He hugged Dad while cameras flashed from every direction. Then Dad did something I'll never forget. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old brass key. It was the original front door key from the very first bakery, mounted on a polished wooden plaque. I'd spent years looking for that key. Dad once told me he'd lost it decades ago. Apparently, he'd been saving it for this moment. He handed it to Kyle. This belongs to you now. The entire room stood and applauded. Employees, customers, family, everyone. Then, every single face turned toward me. Waiting, watching, expecting. Would I cry? Would I argue? Would I ruin Dad's retirement party? I looked at Kyle holding that brass key. A key that opened nothing anymore. The locks had been changed years ago. Still, everyone acted like it meant ownership, like ceremonies mattered more than paperwork. I slowly stood, lifted my glass, smiled. Then I began clapping. Softly, steadily. What a beautiful speech, I said. Dad smiled with relief. Mom looked proud. Kyle mouthed across the room, "Thanks, sis," I smiled back, because in that exact moment, I had already decided what I was going to do. And by the time they realized that old brass key had never belonged to the bakery, there wouldn't be a bakery left for any of them to inherit. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was angry. Anger burns hot. What I felt was colder than that. It was the kind of clarity you only get after someone finally shows you exactly who they are. By sunrise, I'd already made 2 lists. I've always made lists. When emotions get loud, numbers stay honest. The first list was everything I'd done for my family. The years I postponed my own career. The nights I slept in the bakery office because payroll came before sleep. The investors I personally paid off. The loans I guaranteed with my own savings. The equipment I bought when the ovens failed. The marketing campaigns. The expansions. The weekends. The holidays. The birthdays I'd missed. Then I started the second list. Everything my family had done in return. It was much shorter. They smiled. They thanked me. Then they tried giving away the company I owned. Somewhere along the way, they'd stopped seeing my sacrifices. They only saw my availability. That realization hurt more than the betrayal itself, because they genuinely believed they weren't stealing from me. In their minds, they were simply moving family property from one child to another. They'd convinced themselves ownership was just a technical detail. I knew arguing wouldn't fix that. Only reality would. The first text arrived before 9. Kyle. Morning. We should meet Monday about transitioning management. Transitioning management. I stared at those words for a long moment. Then another message appeared. I've already got ideas for expanding the breakfast menu. A third. Melissa thinks we should repaint the dining room. Not one message asked if I agreed. Every message assumed the decision had already been made. I replied with 2 words. Sounds good. Nothing else. Sometimes silence is the loudest answer. Around noon, Melissa posted photos on social media. She'd taken pictures at last night's party. One caption read, "Excited for the next chapter of our family's bakery." Hundreds of congratulations poured in. Customers, neighbors, former employees. Everyone believed the announcement. No one knew a single legal document had changed. By evening, one of my store managers called. He sounded nervous. "Rachel, is Kyle really taking over?" I looked around my living room before answering. "No." A long pause. "He told everyone we're getting new uniforms." "I know. He said he's restructuring management." "I know." Another pause. "What do you want us to do?" I smiled. "For now, nothing. Just keep baking." The next morning, I drove downtown to meet someone I hadn't spoken to in almost a year. His name was Victor Lang, CEO of Hearth and Stone Artisan Bakeries. 8 months earlier, he'd offered to buy my ownership share. Not because we were failing, because we were succeeding. At the time, I'd laughed and declined. The bakery wasn't for sale. It was home. Now, home had changed. Victor greeted me with the same firm handshake. I honestly never expected this call. Neither did I. He motioned toward his office. Coffee was already waiting. After a few minutes of small talk, he leaned forward. "So, what changed?" I I looked out the window for a moment. The people I built it for. He didn't ask another personal question. Business people know when not to. Instead, he opened a folder. The original offer still stands. I read the number. Higher than before. The business had grown. So had its value. I closed the folder. I'm not interested in selling my 80%. Victor frowned slightly. No? I slid the folder back across the desk. I'm interested in something much bigger. His eyebrows lifted. What do you mean? I want to know whether Hearth & Stone would consider acquiring the entire company. Silence. Then, Victor slowly leaned back in his chair. That wasn't the conversation I expected. I know. The other 20% belongs to your parents. It does. They'd have to agree. I know. He studied me carefully. You think they will? I smiled. I think they'll sign almost anything if they believe it's helping my brother. For the first time that morning, Victor laughed. Not loudly, just enough to realize I wasn't joking. Then he became serious again. If this works, I'll keep every employee. No layoffs. No store closures. I'll even keep the family name over the doors. Those words mattered, more than the money. I had spent 12 years building more than a business. I'd built careers. Families depended on those paychecks. I wasn't going to destroy their lives just to teach my own family a lesson. I extended my hand. Then let's see if we can make a deal. He shook it. Quietly. Very quietly. That afternoon, I called the only attorney I'd trusted for years, Elaine Foster. She'd handled every expansion, every investor buyout, every complicated contract I'd ever signed. After I explained everything, there was complete silence on the other end. Finally, she spoke. Rachel, I'm going to ask one question. Did anyone force your parents to sign ownership over to you years ago? No. Did you legally purchase every investor's shares? Yes. Do you own 80%? Yes. She didn't hesitate. Then nobody, not your parents, not your brother, not the mayor himself, can simply declare someone else owner. I closed my eyes. Even though I already knew the answer, hearing it out loud changed something. Elaine continued. If you're asking whether you're legally allowed to sell your ownership, the answer is absolutely. Then she paused. But judging by your voice, I don't think you're calling me because you only plan to sell your share. I smiled. No. I'm calling because by next week, my family is going to discover something they should have learned a long time ago. And what's that? I looked toward the bakery through my office window. Employees laughed while carrying fresh bread into the display cases. Customers filled every table. The place I'd saved was alive. I wasn't going to let anyone treat it like a birthday present. They're about to learn that you can't give away someone else's life's work. And with that, the real plan finally began. The next 4 days passed in complete silence. On the outside, nothing changed. Inside, everything did. Victor's attorneys worked with mine around the clock. Every contract was reviewed. Every signature was prepared. Every detail was airtight. Then came the twist nobody saw coming. When my parents met with the lawyers, they believed they were signing paperwork that would formalize the family transition. They barely read the documents. They trusted the explanation they wanted to believe. 48 hours later, the acquisition was complete. The bakery no longer belonged to our family. Hearth & Stone officially owned every location. Every employee kept their job. Every customer would see the same name above the doors. Only the owners had changed. Meanwhile, Kyle was living in a completely different reality. He ordered business cards with owner printed beneath his name. He scheduled meetings with suppliers. He even invited local reporters to Dad's official handover ceremony on New Year's Eve. Mom called to remind me not to be late. Dad wants the whole family there, she said happily. It's going to be such a special moment. It will be, I replied. She had no idea how right she was. The dining room was packed. Employees, customers, neighbors, relatives, even the local newspaper had sent a photographer. Dad stood beside a ribbon stretched across the entrance. Kyle waited proudly with a pair of oversized ceremonial scissors. Dad lifted the old brass key for everyone to see. Tonight, he announced proudly, our family's legacy passes to the next generation. Applause filled the room. Kyle stepped forward to accept the key. That's when the front door opened. 3 people in business suits walked inside. Victor Lang was leading them. Every conversation stopped. He smiled politely, then looked directly at my father. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said calmly, "but before you hand over those keys, everyone here deserves to know who owns this bakery now." The room fell completely silent. Victor placed a leather folder on the table. Inside were the signed acquisition papers. He calmly explained that as of 2 days earlier, Hearth and Stone Artisan Bakeries had legally purchased the company. Every location, every asset, every piece of equipment, everything. Dad grabbed the papers with shaking hands. His smile disappeared as he found the signatures. His own. Mom's? Mine? This can't be right, he whispered. Victor nodded politely. "I'm afraid it is." Kyle's face turned bright red. "You sold my bakery?" I looked at him quietly. "It was never yours." He slammed the ceremonial key onto the table. "You ruined this family!" I didn't raise my voice. I simply answered, "No." "You tried to give away something you never owned." The room went silent again. My mother looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I thought you'd understand. I thought you could always build another one." I smiled sadly. "I probably could. But that's not the point. The point is, you never asked." No one had an answer. I thanked every employee for believing in me through the difficult years. Then Victor surprised everyone. He announced that I had accepted the position of Regional Operations Director, overseeing every bakery the company owned. The employees applauded. Some even stood. Before leaving, I placed my office keys on the counter. "I'll always love this family," I said. But love isn't permission to take someone else's future. Without another word, I walked out of the bakery. A week later, I started my new job. The employees kept their careers. The bakery continued serving the same community. Only one thing had changed. For the first time in my life, my family finally understood the difference between family and ownership. And they never again confused my kindness with something they were entitled to take.